recording it, so then if somebody doesn't want it to be recorded, then Humans, they let him know that keep their camera in front of you. This is lovely to see everybody here after such a long time. So, welcome to Housmans Bookshop, one of the few remaining radical bookshops in the UK, and it will remain one of the few remaining radical bookshops because I know you're going to buy lots of books here before the end of the evening. Good on you, comrades. Right, so now I would urge you also to, now this is a slightly, I'm a long-term volunteer here, so what we do is I do these talks slightly independently of Housmans, but it's not quite. And I want to particularly thank Tony Zerbrugg, who's over there, who helped make this happen. You know, so good on you, comrade. And also keep an eye on the Housmans website because they're going to slowly start introducing events in different venues as well. So do keep an eye on things. There'll be a keep in touch list at the table there. So please use it so then you can be informed of future events. Now, so where do we go from here? Right, fire exit, the door that you came in. Loser through there. We're going to be recording tonight. Simon's the chap who's going to be taking the recordings. If you don't want to be videoed at any point, most of the time they're going to be focused on the speakers. But at the Q&A, if you don't want to be videoed, let Simon know just now so then he can oblique your face or what have you. Okay, or afterwards, okay, but do make a point of reaching out to him. So, after all of that, we've got three speakers. It's going to be from left to right. We've got I've got 4 books tonight. The first one is done by Thomas Jeffery Miley, who's patron of peace in Kurdistan, the Associate Professor of Political Sociology at University of Cambridge. And it says in the back of his book, Thomas Jeffery Miley, whose contribution to a previous book, Your Freedom in Mind, was widely praised, is Lecturer of Political Sociology at the University of Cambridge and has a PhD from Yale University. Good on you. Right, so the next person is the inimitable Brian Morris. He's a legend within anarchist circles and hold it up so that people can see it. He's also Professor Emeritus of Sociology at Goldsmith's College. And I can tell you for a fact that when I put this email out that, you know, an awful lot of people said that they loved him to bits, former students said they loved him to bits. So there you go. The third person is Dimitrios Roussopoulos. He's the publisher of the 3 books that are here tonight. In fact, we're going to introduce a 4th one as well. But the book, he's the author of this book that's been translated into 5 different languages so far, called Political Ecology, System Change, Not Climate Change. Now, I think that's basically, the other thing is that we've also got another one from Black Rose Press here today, and the title, and that's Your Freedom of Mind, Abdullah Ocalan and the Kurdish Question in Erdogan Society, and that's been edited by this chap here, Thomas Jeffery Miley. Now, they're all at the till, so please consider buying all of them before the end of the night, and we've also got some leaflets from Peace in Kurdistan at the till as well, so I would urge you to take them away as well, because this is a critical issue. So can I pass this on to you? And then about 45 minutes later, they'll move on, then about 45 minutes later, we'll then do a Q&A as well. So if you can start thinking of questions, we'd be ever so grateful.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here today with Dimitrios Roussopoulos, with Estella Schmidt from Peace in Kurdistan. I see some familiar faces out there. Let me just read a little bit from the introduction. I think that's the best way to introduce the book. It begins with a section called Abdullah Ocalan and the Reinvention of Self-Determination. We live in an era of collective existential crisis, in which it is imperative that we think anew the fundamental categories of political life. The material collected in this volume all reflect a preoccupation with self-determination, a concept and principle as indispensable as it is contentious. The chapters were almost all composed as essays in the aftermath of my 2014 encounter with the Kurdish freedom movement, whose leader and inspiration, Abdullah Ocalan, has undertaken an impressive and valiant effort to redefine self-determination from his lonely prison cell on Imrali Island. Before actively engaging with the Kurdish struggle, my orientation towards appeals to self-determination had been perhaps excessively critical. I had long been skeptical of the paradigm of national liberation, within which the discourse of self-determination seems to be most frequently situated. My conviction was that there is a relatively ubiquitous tendency to essentialize and reify the collective self in this discourse, and that therefore the application of a hermeneutic of suspicion seems the most appropriate response to any and all appeals to such a principle. More specifically, I maintain that in any context where the discourse of self-determination emerges as salient, this discourse should be subjected to a sociological interrogation in order to illuminate just how it is embedded in concrete constellations of material and social power relations, and to decipher whether it tends to legitimate and reinforce or alternatively subvert existing hierarchies. I remain convinced that the cultivation of a sociological sensibility, that is, awareness of how the discourse of self-determination is embedded in and tends to affect existing power relations in any given context, is crucial. However, at the same time, I have become increasingly persuaded that it is equally important to pay attention to the creative appropriations and resignifications of the core categories of this discourse, as employed in particular times and places. The transformation of the Kurdish freedom movement, its effort to transcend the paradigm of national liberation, to re-signify self-determination in terms of the struggle for radical, direct democracy against the state, the struggle for multicultural and multi-religious accommodation, the struggle for gender emancipation, and the struggle for ecological sustainability has impressed upon me the potency and potential for simultaneous discursive continuity and paradigm shift. In a word, what we witness is a convergence between appeals to the doctrine of self-determination and the pursuit of the Democratic Confederalist Ideal in the Kurdish context. This is self-determination of a different kind. It is no longer aligned with the aspiration for a sovereign Kurdish nation-state. Instead, it has come to mean the struggle against illegitimate and unjust hierarchy in all its forms, including the domination by the state over political and ethical society, the domination by one ethnicity or sect over others, the domination of man over woman, the domination of humans over nature. This is a most ambitious agenda, the extent of acceptance of which by the activists and core constituency of the movement merits rigorous empirical inquiry, to be certain. However, even at the level of programmatic imperative, the reorientation and rearticulation of self-determination achieved by Ocalan, and at least partially emulated by his followers in the movement, remains quite remarkable. For its part, the United Kingdom has undergone a series of significant transformations in relation to the recognition of its multinational character, including important concessions to the right to self-determination for both Northern Ireland and Scotland. Tony Blair's new Labour government would promise and deliver 2 referenda on devolution of autonomy for Scotland and Wales, both of which passed in 1997. It would also promote a successful peace process in Northern Ireland, leading to the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. The agreement would not only institutionalize a complex consociational power-sharing arrangement for the deeply divided Catholic and Protestant communities, but would also recognize a so-called principle of consent, which would assert both the legitimacy of the aspiration to united Ireland and the legitimacy of the wish to remain part of the United Kingdom, and would also emphasize the right to self-determination for the people of both jurisdictions in Ireland, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, without external interference, and only with the consensus of the majority of people in both polities. In 2014, David Cameron's Conservative government would accept the Scottish Nationalist Party's aspiration to hold a referendum on independence. The plebiscite would galvanize a high level of enthusiasm and popular participation in Scotland, but would ultimately be defeated by a margin of 55 to 45%. In Spain, by contrast, the principle of territorial integrity continues to hold sway. After 4 decades of Franco's fascist dictatorship, which was characterized by an uncompromising unitary Spanish nationalist conception of the state since the transition to democracy in the late 1970s, there has been a significant degree of devolution of autonomy for the Basque Country, Catalonia, and Galicia, as part of the process of configuration of the quasi-federal Estado de las Autonomías. Furthermore, the country's constitution recognizes the right to self-government of the nationalities and regions of which it is composed. However, in the same paragraph, it also declares the indissoluble unity of the Spanish nation. In the Basque Country, neither the more moderate and Christian Democratic Basque Nationalist Party in power at the regional level, nor the violent insurgency of the more radical paramilitary organization ETA has proven capable of forcing any concessions in this regard. ETA would officially abandon its armed struggle in 2011, despite the absence of any peace process similar to the model of Northern Ireland. While in Catalonia, after decades of loyalty to the constitutional order on the part of the conservative Catalan Nationalist Party, long hegemonic at the regional level since 2012, a wave of separatist mobilization took place, in which the demand for the so-called right to decide, or dret a decidir, a neologism advancing in lieu of a full-throated call for self-determination, has come to the fore. In relation to this demand, first in 2014 and then again in 2017, the regional government would organize extra-legal referenda on independence, which, however, have been met with escalating waves of state repression, including significant police brutality on the day of the 2017 referendum, as well as the temporary suspension of regional autonomy and the imprisonment of leading figures from the regional government, who would be convicted on charges of rebellion and sedition and later pardoned. Meanwhile, across the Americas and in Australia and New Zealand, among other places, recent decades have witnessed an impressive resurgence in the mobilization of indigenous identities, with claims of self-determination that somehow even question the very form of the nation-state. These developments would lead the United Nations in 2007 to elaborate and issue a Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Article 3 of which would affirm that indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination, and Article 4 of which would further clarify that indigenous peoples, in exercising their right to self-determination, have the right to autonomy or self-government in matters relating to their internal and local affairs, as well as ways and means for financing their autonomous functions. It is within this broader context of resurgent indigenous mobilization that the Zapatista movement's rather unique struggle for self-determination, conceived as autonomy from the state rather than as a right to a separate state, would emerge. As Emilio del Valle Escalante has explained, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, EZLN, first burst onto the scene in January of 1994 in protest against the passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement. The Zapatistas began as an armed movement declaring war against the Mexican nation-state, but later turned into a social movement that struggled to promote basic human rights and a level of political and cultural autonomy within Mexico. The movement has made clear that it does not want to become a democratic political party, since this would perpetuate a political system that, by gaining power, distances itself from the needs of the people, especially those at the margins. Instead, the Zapatistas have been scrupulous in their efforts to maintain independence from political parties and the state, while promoting instead a mandate of mandar obedeciendo, command by obeying, attempting to transform the political system into one that raises the consciousness of civil society to address the needs and demands of the historically marginalized within modern societies. In this vein, the movement has developed a discourse that addresses the major critical problems that affect not only indigenous peoples, but all those who suffer repression, poverty, discrimination, and political and economic marginalization. From 2003, the Zapatistas established a series of autonomous communities called caracoles in the areas that they effectively control. And in 2012, they would mobilize thousands of indigenous Zapatistas peacefully taking 5 municipalities in Chiapas, and would announce how, after decades of struggle, they had successfully created self-sufficient and autonomous communities with their own political projects and objectives, independent of the Mexican nation-state. Theirs is a vision of self-determination from below, so to speak. They have reinterpreted the principle to mean a way of gaining distance or protection from, rather than inclusion in state institutions, towards which they express a profound sense of alienation, since these carry the stigma of colonial domination. Neither inclusion in the state nor a state of their own. Their struggle for self-determination instead is conceived and practiced as a struggle for direct democratic control apart from the state, even against the state. In this respect, the development of the Zapatista movement demonstrates a strong affinity and parallel with the transformation of the Kurdish freedom movement. Like the Zapatistas, the Kurdish freedom movement has evolved from Marxist-Leninist origins towards the espousal of a more libertarian and autonomous ethos and agenda. Nor is it a coincidence that such an evolution would occur in the wake of the collapse of state communism, with the concurrent questioning of the old paradigm of national liberation. Just one more page. What we witness with these two movements is the emergence from below of a new direct democratic and anti-statist conceptualization and praxis of struggle for self-determination. In the Kurdish freedom movement in particular, much emphasis has been placed on the importance of centering the struggle for gender emancipation as a key pillar of its self-determination project. There is, of course, a longer history to the link between the objectives and aims of national liberation and women's empowerment. For example, Vijay Prashad has recalled how, at an Afro-Asian People Solidarity Conference held in Cairo in 1957, Aisha Abdul Rahman would emphasize both the central role played by women in national liberation movements and in the liberation of women by the struggle. According to Abdul Rahman, the renaissance of the Eastern woman has always coincided with the liberation movements. Instead, she would go so far as to insist that the success of these revolutions depends on the liberation of the enslaved half, on rescuing women from paralysis, unemployment, and inaction, and eliminating the differences between the two halves of the nation, its men and women. And yet, as Prashad nevertheless also admits, these movements remain too often characterized by a certain machismo and lack of appreciation for the role of women. With its ideological and organizational reorientation, the Kurdish freedom movement has sought to tackle this problem of lingering machismo head-on. Likewise, both the Kurdish freedom movement and the Zapatistas have stressed the importance of ecological sustainability as a constitutive component of their anti-state self-determination projects. To this end, the Kurdish freedom movement has embraced, at least in discourse, the paradigm and program of social ecology, while the Zapatistas, perhaps more consistently, have come to embody the values and practices of participatory ecological self-management. In this discourse, and at least partially in the practices of the Kurdish freedom movement and the Zapatistas, then the principle of self-determination has once again been reinvented, this time to connote the struggle for direct democratic control and autonomy from the state, the struggle for gender emancipation, and the struggle for ecological sustainability, among other aims. However, this incipient reinvention still coexists with the classical Leninist understanding of and aspiration for self-determination as the right to a separate and sovereign nation-state. Indeed, as we have seen, the principle of self-determination has been transformed on multiple occasions over the course of the last 2 centuries. It remains a malleable and multivalent concept, even as it has increasingly been codified in international law. And so inevitably, part of the struggle for self-determination in the 21st century entails the struggle to frame what the principle itself means. The essays in this volume are intended as a contribution to this endeavor. The first part of the book brings together some 6 chapters, etc. So that's enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Wow, that's amazing. Well done. Reminder, buy the book.
I know you're insisting on using
Yes, we are insisting. I'm sorry.
Can you hear me?
No, you can hear you better with that. Trust me. Trust me in this one, Brian.
I'm against technology.
I know.
The microphone might be necessary for the recording.
Right. I've got to have this here, have I?
Let's just check the recording. Yes, and point it like that.
Test.
Point it like that.
I'm sorry, Brian. Trust me in this one.
Right, all right. Well, my name's Brian Morris, and I wrote this book mainly as an introduction. I wrote this book mainly as an introduction to a book I've written about Malawi. I've written a book on called Homage to Peasant Smallholders, and it's on agricultural people in Malawi. So this book actually is an introduction to that book, okay? And basically, what my book's trying to do, it's a very personal book in some ways. What I try to suggest is that, one, I try to say what my worldview is, how I think about the world. You know, in philosophical terms, my metaphysics, you know? So I try to express that in the book, and that's the dialectical naturalism bit. And then I also try to, in the book, try to say what I think anthropology is all about and what my approach is to anthropology, you know? And the reason is because I got, not only writing this as an introduction to my book, but I got really upset with what was going on in anthropology, okay? I got here a little article from a few years ago. What it says is the Great Divide, you know, the Great Divide. And it basically argues anthropology is tearing itself apart completely. It actually talks about there's a war going on. There's actually a war going on in anthropology between 2 kinds of approaches, 2 ways of looking at the world. The one is a kind of The one is a kind of neo-Darwinian idea, you know, and it comes from the social biologists, people like Edward Wilson, Pinker, you know, Richard Dawkins and whatnot, and that idea, and what they're basically trying to do is to reduce anthropology to biology, okay? And it's a very kind of radical, very kind of reductive form of materialism. It reduces culture, it reduces consciousness to biology, even to genetics. I mean, somebody like Edward Wilson is talking about a gene culture co-evolution, as it were, you know, as if human beings and social life is not there. Okay, so there's that's the one in the one corner, as it were, in the one corner is actually the neo-Darwinians. Okay, see themselves as very radical, reducing anthropology to biology, a reductive form of materialism. They're materialists, they're very keen on science, okay, but it's very, very reductive. In the other corner is the postmodernists, okay? Years ago, what happened in anthropology, you probably don't know, but particularly connected with Oxford and Cambridge University, they see social anthropology as going through 3 turns. What happened, when I was a student, there was a turn towards semiotics, a turn towards language. It was called the symbolic turn, and it was connected with people like Levi-Strauss, and it was with other people like that. Looking at what anthropology should do is just look at language and interpret different cultures. Okay. Then, of course, 10 years later, in the 1980s and 1990s, there was what was called the postmodern turn. Okay, the postmodern turn. Okay. Now, of course, these scholars at Oxford and Cambridge, you know, they're all this time seeing there's a new. Every time I write books, I mean, I read books and it says, this is a new approach to anthropology. This is a new approach to the world, as it were. You know, all these exaggerated claims. The next turn, which happened about 10 years ago, was called the ontological turn. They got the word ontology from Heidegger. Do you know Heidegger? You know, heard of Heidegger? He's a very famous German philosopher. Anyway, they got this idea of ontology. All it was basically was postmodernism. It was revamping, just the new concepts, ontology, okay, but it was just a revamping of basically postmodernism. 25 years ago, believe it or not, I wrote an article, and it was a critique of postmodernism, and it was called, believe it or not, In Defense of Realism and Truth. And that was and it was actually subtitled something like a critique of the anthropological followers of Heidegger, you know, that sort of thing. What the postmodernists want to do is basically convert anthropology either to a branch of literature, okay, or to be involved in semiotics, just looking at language, okay, or actually just doing ethnography. Ethnography is going off somewhere or other into the jungle somewhere and studying some people. So they want you to convert it just to ethnography. Or, even better, one person wrote, oh, we don't have anything to do with social organisation as anthropologists. We don't know anything to do with that sort of things. We don't have anything to do with history. Anthropology should be autobiography, you know? So we should go to the field and just, you know, take notes and express our experiences and whatnot. Okay, so that of course was completely idealist. And I'll give you a quote. Where's that bit of paper? Where's my glasses? I'm sorry about this. I just want to give you an impression of what I'm going to do by giving you an impression what I'm against. Oh, you can't hold this. How do you do it?
I'll hold it. Go on.
Right. Listen to this. Listen to this carefully. Listen to this carefully. This is by an anthropologist called Woolgar, and it's connected with Latour. Have you ever heard of Latour?
Yeah.
Bruno Latour. Oh, you should. You should. He's had more sites. You know they measures how many times you've been cited. Latour has had more sites than Marx and Heidegger. You know, so he's obviously an important scholar. Anyway, this is what he said. This is what he said. This is a mode of analysis. It consists of with the position of the idealist wing of ethno-methodology, that there is no reality, get this, there is no reality independent of words, okay, i.e. text, signs, documents, that we use to apprehend it. In other words, reality, okay, is constituted in and through discourses, you know? In other words, the world out there doesn't exist. You know, it's not real. What is real is language, you know, and that kind of approach is now often referred to as social constructionism or cultural idealism, like that. Now, what this book is about is 3 things. One, this divide, this great divide between the postmodern idealists on the one hand, okay, and all these neo-Darwinian reductive materialists on the other. There's another way, not just me, but there are other anthropologists saying, look, actually, there's another way of doing anthropology, by either being kind of neo-Darwinian or pretending the world doesn't exist. Okay, and that's what my book is about. My book's about saying three things. What is? The first part of the book is on what I call philosophical realism. Okay, philosophical realism is everybody accepts this in common sense. You know, everybody in common sense realizes this. But philosophically, philosophical realism means there is a world, a material world that exists, not known, exists, independent and pre-exist human beings and their cognition and their experiences. Okay, that's it. Everybody recognizes this in their common sense ideas, you know. Everybody reckons when a volcano erupts, it's not because I've got a language that describes the volcano, but it's the volcano's actually erupting as a real thing, independent of any human being. So that's the first thing I kind of argue in the book. The second thing is, my book's unpopular, because that is not what most people think. You know, most academic anthropologists and postmodernists don't think that. In fact, I've got somebody who says, now, the ontology idea was, look, this idea that people have got, like you lot, this idea that there's one world, the Earth, there's one world, okay, and people have different conceptions of it. You know, people in Malawi think of the world like this way, you know, and somebody thinks like this way, and the Buddhists think in that way. Oh, that's not the case at all. There isn't a world out there. What there is different worlds, and they take it from Heidegger, that there's the concept of worlding. In other words, we make the world, okay? So everybody in different cultures, they live in different worlds. They don't live in one world. You know, when I go to Malawi and we see a hyena, it's, you know, my friends actually live in a different world to me, according to these postmodernists, you know. Part one of my book really is criticising that whole postmodern kind of scenario, you know. The idea, it's all coming from Kant. It's all coming from Kant, you know, and it argues that. The second part of my book, is called Varieties of Materialism. I'm an old-fashioned materialist, okay? In other words, what is real? What is real? What is real is matter. Not matter in some abstract way. What is real is material things are real. Material things are real, okay? The mountain's real. You know, rivers are real. Physical objects are real. You know, I'm real. Okay, dogs are real. Okay, social systems are real. That's where reality is. But being a materialist doesn't mean you don't think of time and all that. A materialist recognises time. A materialist recognises space. A materialist recognises life. A materialist recognises consciousness. A materialist recognises culture. What a materialist says, though, is that these things don't exist on their own, separate from material things. In other words, space. Space is just a relationship between things. Time is just a kind of a sequel of different events in the world that relate to things. Okay? Life comes out of matter. Consciousness comes out of material. I'm a material living being. And consciousness comes out of that. So consciousness, time, space, culture, life are not independent. They exist. They're important. But they don't exist independent of material things. Okay? Now, there's a lot of criticisms against materialism, and in the book I'll go over them. I won't go into them all because you things, but what they basically are, you got material things, and then also you got things like actions. You got material things, and you got things like relationships. You got material things, and you got things like sort of like that, all that sorts of things like that. And so they set up this. I've just read a book by one of my friends who's quite a well-known anthropologist now. He's a bit of a goalie, old Tim Ingold. Tim Ingold, in his book, just out, it's a collection of essays, he says, cows don't exist, humans don't exist, you know, elephants don't exist, you know, frogs don't exist. What exists is frogging, dogging, humaning, and things like that. In other words, the argument is material things don't exist, but they're just processes exist. Just processes. The thing is, though, processes do not exist independent of things. So if you think of humaning, you know, a human being existed and whatnot, you know, I go walking, okay? But walking does not exist independent of the fact that I'm a human being with legs. Okay? Digestion. I need to digest things to live. Digestion is a process. But it doesn't exist independent of the fact I'm a human being and I've got a stomach. Seeing is a process. It doesn't exist without you've got eyes to see and something to see. You know? And the other one, I won't go on too much of things, but the other one is about relationships. You know, what everything is in terms of relationships, okay? So they sometimes say, well, material things don't exist, just sort of, you know, relations exist, okay? And there's a big debate in philosophy between a group of philosophers who call themselves objective-oriented philosophers, and there's Latour, who says that everything in the world consists of actons. And he's now in his latest book, he talks about terrestrials. Everything in the world's a terrestrial, you know? And so they stress the importance of things. And then there's people like my friend Tim Ingold, who says, oh, no, things don't exist. All things are is relationships. For a materialist, there are no things at all. This idea you can have things that are separate with no relation is a myth. Nothing can exist without it's related. I can't exist tomorrow without I continually breathe and eat. Everything's intrinsically related to something else. And all relationships imply things. So you've got to see things dialectically. And in the book, when I go over materialism, I'll look at the three important materialists. Charles Darwin and his lot, okay? Karl Marx and his lot, okay? And a Canadian scholar called Bungay and systems theory. I'll go over their basic ideas of materialism, things like that. No. So that's what this. I'll dodge things, but I'll just something say about Latour actually, because what tends to happen with the postmodernists, they conflate things in the world, material things, with our ideas about it. You know, when I was a student, there was a famous philosopher sort of said, look, for goodness sake, never confuse, don't confuse the map with the territory. Don't confuse ideas with material things, like that. Now you've got Latour, bless him, and somebody went to Egypt and started looking at the old graves and whatnot, and they came up with the idea that this old pharaoh had died of TB, tuberculosis, from the microorganism. Latour wrote an article saying, oh, stupid, you know. How could he die of TB? Because TB was only discovered, they only discovered the microorganism, they only discovered it in the 19th century. So how on earth could this pharaoh die with in relation to this bacteria or whatever it is that causes TB. I'll tell you a secret. I don't tell many people. It's my only claim to fame. My only claim to fame. I actually discovered an insect that was new to science. New to science. The trouble is, it's a parasitic, flightless earwig that feeds on rat droppings. You know? Now, according to why I mention this, according to Latour's theory, this earwig didn't exist until I discovered it, which is ridiculous, you know. And he has this idea of, now he's got terrestrials, which talked about actons. And he talked about all these different things in the world, which are actons. And everything in the world's an acton. A business corporation's an acton, a mountain's an acton, frogs an acton, a witch is an acton, God's an acton, you're an acton. You know, everything we recognise as things is an acton. It acts. Okay? In his later books, he talks about these things being terrestrials, you know, terrestrials. The trouble is, it confuses what are material things and what are concepts. What are concepts? He talks about, you know, Harry Potter as being an acton. He talks about, you know, Buffy the Vampire Slaughterer, you know, as being a kind of, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Witches exist because they're believed by certain people in certain cultures, but they don't have any reality. They don't act. They've got no energy. So when I go in Malawi, okay, and you get a group of young men, mostly Christian evangelists, who go into an old lady's house and with a machete. Oh, sorry. They go with a machete actually and kill the old lady. They do not eradicate witches. Because witches is a concept. You can't kill a concept. They don't kill witches. They kill a poor old woman, you know, who's accused of being a witch. Okay? And they're usually, in Malawi anyway, they're usually after the woman's land. Okay? So I defend three things. I defend philosophical realism, that the world exists independent of us, and I defend materialism as a materialist way of looking at things. The third way I do it, in relation to what I started with these, you know, on the one hand all these Darwinians, and on all the other hand all these sort of postmodernists, what I argue for anthropology is actually, this is what it's been for a century or more, ever since Boas. What anthropology is basically is a form of knowledge. It's a form of knowledge that tells us things about the world in Malawi or down anywhere. It's a form of knowledge. Okay, and basically, it's a kind of historical way of looking at things. It's a kind of historical. If you had to summarize it, to me, it's a historical social science. It's not a form of autobiography. It's not a form of biology. It's a form of knowledge that's historical, and it's a form of science. And why is it? I don't know if you know this, but what is unique about anthropology? It's both universal and it's relative. It emphasizes humanism, history, philosophy, culture. Anthropology is often thought of as the study of culture, and it also emphasizes humanity, universalism. So it links together. Anthropology links together what you could call humanism with naturalism. It combines hermeneutics, understanding somebody, what they're saying, and it combines it with science. And that's so. The three things in the book I'm defending because of all the anthropology. I'm a kind of lone anthropologist. I mean, everybody else is a postmodernist, as far as I can see. I'm defending these three things: realism, materialism, and anthropology as a historical science. That's it.
Political Ecology with Dimitrios Roussopoulos.
Yes, thank you. I want to say three things to begin with. One is to thank most sincerely and most warmly the good people of Housmans Bookshop for allowing this event to take place, which is a clear indication that as far as central London is concerned, more or less, COVID is almost over. And in doing that, I would also like to thank Michael, this young Michael here, who did an excellent job in organizing this event here tonight. The physical layout and the preparations and so on, and of course Simon, who's going to record and is recording this whole event down for posterity. And I would also like to thank Tony from Global Books, who is our representative in the world of booksellers and librarians in this country. Having said that, I would also like to say that when you buy these books, it's very important to get these living, very interesting authors to sign them. And I'll tell you why. I speak from experience, because once you read them, and a year or two from now you want to sell them, it is actually increases the value of the books. So it's a kind of investment. Get them to sign it. The third thing I would like to say is that after we have a good discussion here, it will only be in the beginning. It will only be a beginning discussion. There's so much to talk about. So we're all going to graduate from the bookstore to a local pub around the corner here, and we can drink and snack and carry on a very interesting discussion until we are ready to move on to something else. Those are my introductory remarks. As far as the book is concerned, Political Ecology, I would like to say the following things. It has had an incredible international resonance because the book already exists in Danish, in French, apart from English, of course, in Greek and in Turkish. And other language publishers are looking at it too. And why is this the case? You may, by and by, take notice that in a country called Turkey, on the 14th of May, there will be a national election. And if we hope for the best, a certain creepy crawly, whose name begins, his family name begins with an E, may go down in defeat. But in Istanbul, there is a very interesting new movement, a new political phenomenon that is kick-started, which is called the Green Left Party. And last time I was in Greece, they heard that I was there, so they went out of their way to invite me to go to Istanbul to speak at their big congress, which I did. And it also was used an occasion to launch the Turkish edition of the book. So these things all are connected, and it's good to see the impact of books. It's not enough to publish books. It's also to follow their trajectory, their social and political trajectory. And that's what I hope will happen with the two books that, the two authors in the two books that preceded my remarks. As far as Political Ecology, the book is concerned, in English, what it does is constructively criticizes the environmental movement as it exists. Because the environmental movement, as you probably have surmised, has a number of schools. They tolerate each other sometimes, and they are in conflict, deep conflict amongst each other a lot of the times. And it's important for us who are concerned about the future of society and the future of nature and the whole question of climate change. It is important for us to know these various schools of thought and what distinguishes them from each other and what they have in common, to the extent that they do have things in common. Because if we're going to be socially and politically engaged in the question, we really have to know A from B and B from C and so on. So in that sense, the book has a big chunk that interprets these various schools within the environmental movement. The second thing that the book does is that it describes in some detail the big brouhahas that take place from time to time under the title COP. The one that I participated in was in Paris, COP 21. Subsequently, there have been a whole series of other big international meetings. And it's very important to look at who goes to these big meetings and who says what. And at the COP 21 big meeting that took place in Paris, they could not agree, surprise, surprise, to a concluding statement and a concluding agreement to the wee hours in the morning. And I remember the environmentalists and the ecologists had a big, huge public meeting waiting for the statement to become public. So you could imagine the quarrels that were going on behind the scenes, and the quarrels behind the scenes between the scientists, you know, because the IPCC, which we all know about, has about 13 to 14,000 climate scientists from all over the world who are trying to gauge what is really going on and the consequences of what is really going on. And so you could almost hear the quarrels going on between the scientists behind the scenes in the various meeting rooms in Paris and the politicians and the bureaucrats who are saying, no, you can't say this and you can't say that. No, this is going too far, and so on and so forth. And finally, the statement came out. And I was at this big public meeting where we were waiting for the statement to come out to see what the hell they were going to say. Well, what did they say? It was a fart in the wind. And people like Naomi Klein and other people took the microphone and said, you know, this is just another wish-wash. You know, the temperature, the planet temperature must not increase by X number of degrees, otherwise we're cooked. Well, you know, what a revelation, what a conclusion. But in the meantime, and the book deals with all of this, all the corporate interests behind all of this stuff also. In the meantime, the IPCC, the International Panel of Climate Change Scientists, have issued most recently, this year, another one of their reports. And we should take note of this. And to me, the most revealing, probably to you also, the most revealing part of the report is that the climate change crisis, apart from being real, very real, is having an extraordinarily negative psychological impact on young people from the ages of 18 to 26. Devastating effect. I mean, I just read a report that in South Korea, 350,000 young people of that age group are sort of isolated at home. They don't know what to do with their lives. And this is a big phenomena. And it affects why, instead of having 80 people here tonight, why there isn't 800. You know what I mean? People really, especially this younger group, have really problems in dealing with the threat of their immediate future and of those people that they're close to. So the book deals with all of this stuff and concludes with a roadmap. It is a roadmap based largely on social ecology. It is a roadmap that emphasizes the importance of the neighborhood, the urban neighborhood, more specifically, because there was a very interesting Greek way back when called Archimedes, who said, if I only found the right place to put the crowbar, I could move the planet. What is that thing? Eh?
Lever.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. And that's what the book proposes. The book proposes that we have to start from our immediate environment. It's all very nice for us to be here tonight from all over London, but it's very important for us to know our neighbors, work with our neighbors, try to develop the awareness amongst our neighbors, think of the neighborhood as a whole, think of other neighborhoods in the city, think of a kind of social and urban transformation as we are transforming ourselves. In other words, it is in fact very much in line with what Jeff talks about building self-determination from below. It talks very much in the way in which Brian Morris talks about reality, material reality, which is as soon as you open up your front door, there it is. If you don't deal with what is immediately in front of you, then what are you doing running around from movement to movement and reading from one radical periodical to the other to give you some kind of self-satisfaction? That is not real politics. We have to invent politics. We have to reinvent politics. And between you and me and these four walls, politics begins at home. It belongs to where we live. It belongs to how we have to relate to people around us. And that is the crowbar that is going to move things forward according to the roadmap that is described in much more detail in the book Political Ecology. Because we're not talking about climate change, we're talking about system change. The system has to change. Root and branch, dear friends, root and branch, the system has to change. Now, that is a whole discussion in considerable detail that needs to take place between us after a couple of pints of beer, but it is what is in fact real and material. Thank you for your attention.
It's going to be very difficult to anybody future talks to top what's just been said there between the three of them. First of all, thank you very much. Now, before the Q&A, what we'd also like to highlight is we've got a couple of people in the audience who've got future events and things like that happening. And before we finish tonight, we'll get them just to stand up for 2 seconds and tell you what's going on. But right now, do you guys want to, have you got any comments to make between each other just now before we switch to the Q&A? Okay, right. So we've got questions. Right, so we're going to take Les, and now we're going to take Mo, okay? And then we'll take yourself. I've forgotten your name, but I know you anyway. Norman, good to see you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks for the 3 talks. I'll resist temptation to put questions to all 3 of you. Everyone wants an opportunity. So I'll limit myself to just Jeff, and I'd like to probe the final phrase, which perhaps was the most important, namely, if I remember, that self-determination is a project of creating a new kind of collective self, a transformative collective self that transforms society and goes beyond the nation state. And in that regard, I wanted to ask about the quite different examples you gave of demands for self-determination. I mean, some of them, and so my basic question is, how do you see those differences and what could be learned from them, either as positive lessons or negative lessons about what not to do? I mean, some of them, which are known globally, are demands for self-determination over a political jurisdiction, a sub-state jurisdiction, within which there are wildly divergent agendas, and even within the Scottish independence movement and Catalan and so on, incompatible politics within them. Well, that's what politics is about, right? By contrast with, and demands to transfer powers and budgets from the national government to a sub-state government. You've got other examples. I mean, for example, the Zapatistas is clearly antagonistic to anything like that. I mean, they were demanding, well, still are demanding, autonomy for those localities which declare themselves to be autonomous communities, and at the same time is trying to inspire more localities to declare themselves to be such. And a fundamental principle has always been to reject state aid, to reject any aid from the national government. And then the Rojava experiment, as it's sometimes called, has more in common, obviously, with the Zapatistas, but it also has differences from the Zapatistas. So I'm wondering, what do you see as positive or negative lessons to be learned from these quite different efforts towards self-determination, especially as regards transforming a collective self?
Brilliant, thanks very much, Les. Now, Les has actually got a book coming out in a few weeks' time by Bristol University Press. Can you tell me what the title is again?
Okay, it's called Beyond Climate Fixes, From Public Controversy to System Change.
There you go.
A very popular concept these days, but what does it mean? Well, your book and my book try to explain what it should mean.
Thank you very much, Les. Mo? Yeah, that's what we're going to do.
Thank you to all of you, and thank you, Michael, for helping to organize this, or organizing this. Okay, thank you to the entire team. So, Professor Thomas Jeffery Miley. This distinction between self-determination for nations and nation-states versus self-determination for peoples from a more bottom-up perspective, which you've described, it sounds like on the one hand you're saying that this is a new sort of paradigm, but isn't it actually a rediscovery of this sort of debate or two different perspectives on self-determination that even from 100 years ago, or even if we look at the Paris Commune, what have you, that this is a struggle that seems to be consistently popping up of people attempting to have their own sort of local self-determination that's not rooted in a state hierarchy, certainly nation state as well as, I suppose, more modern, and then just getting crushed by nation states and then re-emerging.
Thank you very much, Mo. Norman?
I just wanted to ask, is it Brian is your name, isn't it? There's an example of what you're saying, I think, in physics. I don't know if you discussed it in your book, because the universe has been going on quite happily for 13,000 million years without anyone observing it or knowing anything about it. But some modern physicists say there's no actual objective properties until you actually measure something. Well, it's true that the act of measuring may alter it, and there are problems there. But obviously there is a realism, there must be a realistic description of physics which we've yet to find. And unfortunately, Albert Einstein, who was a realist, didn't manage to come up with it, so there's still work to be done there.
So just do 2, 3, then we'll come straight back. Correct. Oh, let's go. Okay, what's your name?
Connor.
Connor.
My name is Connor. Thank you to the speakers and the organizers, to echo that again. My question is for Brian. My question is, do you believe that matter behaves dialectically? And do you believe that matter behaves dialectically? Depending on how we define dialectics, I suppose. And the follow-up question is, if yes, why do you think things are such that that is the case? And if no, perhaps if you could share how you do think things display, what sort of regularities they display in their behavior.
Any women? 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 Oh, lovely. So let's look at around the front. I forgot to look at women at the back. Thank you.
Hi, my question is, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, but Mr. Roussopoulos. Just you mentioned in the report about the sort of despair of people aged 18 to 26, and I just about fit in there. And maybe this is in your roadmap and I'll get there when I read the book. But I'm just wondering if you have any advice on staying optimistic, and what, when we've been growing up with impending doom, and feeling a little powerless, what sort of advice you'd have there?
Lovely, thank you. Anybody else? We'll come right back. Please think of some other questions. Go on, John. Go on, Flash, go on. You sure? No, go on. Go for it. That's good.
Thanks. Question for Brian as well. I was wondering what you think the relationship between philosophical realism and the political philosophy of anarchism might be. As far as I see it, anarchism says that there's something that human nature is, and that societies ought to be organised in accordance with that. So I wonder what you think.
I want to ask something about Kurdistan later on, and I want to also include something about China, because I think that's going to be a big issue myself. But anyway, I'll just bring these back to yourselves right now.
Go on. Yeah, what is... three questions. One is difficult to answer your question about modern physics, as it were. I mean, there's so much interpretation. I mean, I'm not a physicist, so I can't say, but there's a Copenhagen theory of physics basically saying that. In fact, I heard a lecture from Deepak, somebody or other, forgot his name, who was basically an Indian Swami, really, but he had a PhD in nuclear physics, as it were, okay, quantum physics, and he basically said, well, what physics has shown is the world is completely dematerialized. The world, there is no matter. Basically, everything is consciousness. And this was a lecture at Dartington who gave this, and everybody applauded him. And I thought, well, Jesus, is this, And there's a great debate, as you probably know, the great debate in physics about particular certain Bohr and people like that, looking at it from terms of a kind of what you might call the subjective idealism kind of way. That we can never, because we can't be sure of it. We can never be sure about anything really, so we can't say anything about it. But I always followed Bunge, who was a physicist actually. So he gets a big mention in my book because he's a very fundamental materialist. To say that modern physics hasn't dematerialized the world, doesn't. And I always feel though that this uncertainty principle, you can either measure it where it is or you can measure its movement as it were. You can't do two things at once. I often think about termites in Malawi, because you can either look at termites as the loveliest thing on earth because they're smashing to eat. The really richest thing you can think of. Okay, so they're wonderful creatures. Or you can look at termites that they destroy your houses and things like that. But you can't look at it at the same time. They're completely contradictory, But it doesn't mean there's no termites. And I think it's the same with physics. Just it doesn't mean there's no particles in the material sense. I've not really answered your question because I'm not really a physicist, but dialectics. I didn't mention dialectics because I was waffling on and I didn't want to go on for too long. Dialectics is not a metaphysics. It's not metaphysical. Okay. Dialectics. I got a lot of friends who reckon that dialectics is just mumbo jumbo. It's just mumbo jumbo. And there's a very famous, he started off a Marxist called Sidney Hook, and he sort of said, well, what on earth, has Newton's theory of gravity and the life history of insects got to do with dialectics? Now, I tend to follow dear old Engels, although I don't like his politics, but what was important about Engels at the end of the 19th century? Three things were happening at the 19th century. There was all the thing with Helmholtz and the physics were developing, and there was a concept of entropy, and that was happening. There was a knowledge about the cell, okay, and there was Darwin's evolutionary theory. And Engels reckoned that had completely undermined the Cartesian notion of a mechanistic world, as it were. Okay. And what Engels basically said when you look at dialectics, what dialectics mean? It's simply, quite simply, just a way of looking at the world, okay? And it avoids two extremes. It avoids seeing things in terms of dualism. Everything is seen in a kind of binary, absolute dualism, which goes to Plato and Descartes, okay? It's also against the idea that you can collapse things. You know, like the subject-object. I mean, I've got friends that say, oh, the subject-object distinction, you know, it's completely useless, you know. Don't see things like the subject-object in terms of opposition, but you have to see it in terms of a distinction. In fact, if everybody distinguishes, even amoebas distinguish themselves as subjective things from the world. So both in knowledge and in terms of life, there's a distinction between a subject and the objective world. But the important thing with dialectics is not to see what is a distinction as an opposition. Okay. Three things. One is, with dialectics, is to understand, going back to Heraclitus, that everything is changing. All material things are continually changing, all the time. Everything. Buddha was saying this donkeys years ago. In fact, people have argued that Buddha was, you know, the historical Buddha was the first dialectical thinker. You know, because he was basically saying, you know, everything's changing all the time. Things come into things, they develop and they fade away. That's it. That's the way of the world. Everything's changing. So that's the first principle of dialectics. It's a way of thinking, way of understanding the world, a way of approaching the world, and it sees things as forever changing. There's nothing stable. Nothing is stable. Nothing is stable. The second thing is, with dialectics, you can never understand a thing but seeing it in isolation. All things are related to other things. You can't study things in a kind of atomistic way. You have to see things in terms of relationships. And the third one is actually to look at things not in dualism, not conflation. You know, I always think of old Bookchin. Bookchin always used to quote Hegel. Hegel criticised people that collapse distinctions, and he used the phrase. He used it against Shelley. He said, "Oh, this person thinks that all the cows are black at night." You know, you can't. Or something, a phrase like that. You know, all the cows are black at night. You know, you can't distinguish anything. What dialectics does, it distinguishes and discriminates things, but it also sees that they're united. So there's a kind of opposition in unity, or a distinction in unity, like that. And that's all dialectics means. You know, it doesn't apply to nature itself. You know, it's not going to say is an atom dialectical or things, because it's in terms with knowledge. It's an epistemological thing, not a metaphysical. It's not about what the world is. It's about how human beings approach the world in terms of knowledge, and saying that you look things in like, you know, like the classic one is the relationship between humans and nature. It's a dialectical relationship. On the one hand, humans are separate from nature. I'm separate from nature. If I wasn't separate from nature, I'd walk under the first bus. You know, there's a distinction there, but there's no opposition because humans are part of nature. So, you know, there's a kind of dialectic. On the one hand, you're part of nature, on the other hand, you're separate from nature. Same with between humans and social life. You know, you're a part of society. You're a part of society, but you're an independent society. But they're not separate. There's not a dualism between a social group and an individual. But they are distinct. There is a distinction between a group and an individual. There's a distinction between me and the Richard Jeffery Society, you know. But the Richard Jeffery Society's got humans in it, so it's not. It's a dialectical ratio. You got what I mean? I don't know if that answers your question. It's a thing like that. It's not about the world, dialectics. It's a way of approaching the world, kind of thing. And what was yours? My memory only goes for about 5 minutes.
The relationship between philosophical realism and anarchism.
Oh, I know. I see. I've argued this because, as you probably know, there's a whole movement in anarchism actually which is called the post-anarchism. Okay, and they've taken all these ideas of post-anarchism. Saul Newman is a typical example. They're all into Lacan and Heidegger and all that, you know, and sort of things like that. And I've been opposed. I've written lots of articles against postmodernism and anarchism. I go back to all the old anthropologists were dialectical naturalists, all of them, like, you know, they were like Marx, they were materialists. If you look at Bakunin, I've written a lot on Bakunin, you know, you published a book by Bakunin years ago, they were like, but Bakunin was a dialectical naturalist, you know. Bakunin, Kropotkin was a dialectical naturalist, you know, Bookchin was a dialectical naturalist, Chomsky's a dialectical naturalist. So they actually see a materialist way of looking at the world that provides a grounding for anarchism, you know, for an anarchist politics, as it were. But there's never any simple relationship between people's metaphysics and politics. You can have, there's a lot of people who are materialists, and they're quite, in their politics, they're right wing. You know what I mean? Yeah. And there's some people who are postmodernists, which I disagree with in kind of philosophical terms. Actually, they're like Deleuze is one. Yeah. But actually in their politics I kind of agree with. So there's never a simple relationship between sort of one's philosophical thinking and one's political. It's a complex relationship. But basically I think the only real grounding for anarchism is actually dialectical naturalism, evolutionary naturalism, you know.
And that's why this book is so important. It's about anthropology and dialectical naturalism, which is available at the counter. Thank you very much, Brian. Now, bear with me 2 seconds. Now, can you remind me what the question was that was posed towards Dimitri? With the woman, what was the question again?
Advice for not killing yourself when... Advice for not, like, crying when you're 25.
I have hope in the 21st century.
What's that? Oh, sorry.
Hope in the 21st century.
Hope in the 21st century.
For young people.
300,000 people in South Korea.
350,000. Yeah. Well, there's a short answer and there's a long answer. The short answer, and I speak from experience, because I'm in my city and in my neighborhood, I'm surrounded by the most extraordinary ensemble of young activists of that age group, by the way. And it's a combination of factors. It's what we have done in our neighborhood, for example, something very concrete that they helped with at a certain point in the evolution of the struggle to save a neighborhood of 6 urban blocks in the center of the city from being completely demolished by speculators, and to create, now listen to this, to create a community of 22 housing cooperatives, small housing cooperatives, to assure democratic participation amongst its members, and to build a federation or a confederation of these 22 housing cooperatives, in which some 1,250 people live, by the way, so it's not a small thing, based upon a land trust. I don't think anybody in this room knows what a land trust is, but I'll tell you. It is a community that owns all the land in common. So there can be no buying and selling of property. Private property has been abolished. This has created an optimism, if you will, a sense of hope that things can be done at the grassroots level. But in doing that, very important, we have to also transform ourselves as individuals. In other words, it's not something that you're going to learn at University of Cambridge or Goldsmith by listening to some very articulate and brilliant academics. You have to do it, and you have to learn from your experience nourished by these ideas, by this analysis, but in the end, it's by doing something. And that's what the emphasis of the book is. And that is a very important element in giving young activists or young people who want to be activists, who are tempted but who do not know how to proceed. That is a very important part of the answer. The second part is, and I'm not being facetious, is to listen to very good music. You have to nourish your emotional intelligence, because there's just so much you can learn from all this stuff around here by reading it. You have to feel it. And where do you get those feelings? By listening to good music.
Yeah, just real briefly, Les, with respect to your question, I think that there are multivalent understandings of what self-determination means. And in the European context, what we've seen are a variety of different movements pushing for some kind of autonomy from the central state, but pushing for their own nation states. Whereas the Zapatista and the Kurdish examples are from below, and they're radically against the state. And so, even though in the Kurdish movement in Syria, they make it very clear that what they want is a democratic and free Syria. So they make it very clear that they're not for separation and the creation of an autonomous Greater Kurdistan, but that would be something that would be confederal, in which instead of changing borders, transcendence of borders. So I think that's in a nutshell what the distinction is between the two different types of self-determination movements. But I think we live in a world in which the older version, and over 250 years, I sketched it over 250 years, it's changed many times what self-determination has meant for people. But the older Marxist-Leninist understanding of self-determination remains quite dominant. But there are these alternatives that are coming up with the indigenous peoples, that are coming up with the Zapatistas and with the Kurds, that I think are the ones that excite me. So thank you.
So I've got Estella wanting to ask any questions. Is anybody else wanting to catch my eye at any time? Well, please consider, just while I speak to Estella does her thing.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
yeah. Well, I'm Estella. I've been involved with the Kurdish movement for 40 years or longer, with the international movement, and I'm 82 years. The question is important. I will try to focus, because I'm an activist. I was in the past, I had my own profession. I came from the theater, from the arts, from politics since 1941, when I was born in a Vienna being divided, bombed, and destroyed. And I'm now working with the Kurdish freedom movement as the main movement, apart from other international organizations from Sri Lanka, the Tamils, the Baluch, the Kashmiri, you name it. Internationalism is one of the biggest challenges. A global internationalism, a global thinking. Now when we speak here, I want to make first of all 2 points about Jeff's book. Books. Your Freedom and Mine, and this particular book. Now Jeff, although he's a lecturer at Cambridge, he dared to challenge Cambridge in many ways. One of the biggest challenges that he went to Rojava with a delegation and then challenged with the ideas, which was a very difficult task, okay? Because the book that was produced in discussion both with members of the Kurdish movement, of the wider Kurdish movement, and with us because it had to be produced somehow. It was a book that needed to be written. That wasn't a task by a lecturer, but somebody involved in a struggle. And I want to thank him openly at this particular occasion for the tremendous sacrifice he has made, both as an individual and leading to his main work. He went to Kenya, to Nairobi, and worked with the local grassroots organizations. I do not know one person here from the university who has done that, except maybe one or two people by coincidence. And maybe because they visited and tried to research. But we are talking about here that our whole mind in that period we live under has to change. In both, not just thinking and writing books, but in real life, in participating in movements, in real thinking. So I think that the production of the book alone proved that the book could be produced in those circumstances with the Kurdish community involved from Rojava, from all parts of Kurdistan and in Europe. Everybody knows about Chef from the Kurdish movement, but not just them, but other people now in the international community. And the fact is that it is only an example. I wish there were more people doing that, okay? That we cannot sort of, it's so difficult to break this wall, to break the wall of the left, to break the wall of the activists, to break the wall between activists. He mentions the environmental movement was the whole movement linking on the ecological questions, you know, coming together on these issues. We have separate people working in separate movements, in separate organizations, doing their own thing. Now, it's not going to be a challenge for anyone. And in fact, the government is wallowing in it. It's wonderful. We have all these divided people and divided organizations. So the big call is something else altogether, to work together on these issues. And the self-determination becomes this absolutely central question, because it's not just about 100 years ago, 200 years ago. It's not about the revolution of 1905, 1917. No, it is about a rethinking of what it really means. And that Mr. Ocalan has gone back thousands of years to discover. And many people have already tried also to follow that. They have tried to rethink the thing, and about among the Zapatista people, among other people in different parts of the world. I've spoken to a friend in India recently, and there's massive amount of communities who are doing precisely that. So the struggle is actually happening all over the world. We just need to find these people, to support them, to bring them together, to link them up together, and to find ways to be constructive of the day, you know. And I really think, as I said, self-determination is at the center of it. Ecology, you name it, okay? And it's a philosophical, it's a spiritual thing, philosophical thing, it's everything. Okay, and thank you very much for organizing that. Peace in Kurdistan is very grateful for that, and thank you all the speakers, and particularly Jeff, for all the sacrifices he has made. This has to be said aloud. Okay?
Thank you very much, Stella. We are running more or less to the end of time, but so has anybody got any final questions or what have you? But please be brief. Come on, if you've got, this is your chance. This is your golden chance. Is anybody? Go on. Norman.
Can I ask Brian, what is the difference between dialectical materialism and dialectical naturalism?
I don't see any difference. I think there's a lot of terms that people use, like with the Marxists they talk about dialectical materialism or historical materialism. You know, some philosophers like Sellers talk about evolutionary naturalism. I take it from Bookchin, because I like dialectics, and he talks about dialectical naturalism. The problem is both naturalism and, like every word and every concept, naturalism and materialism are very often used in ways that, you know, have got meanings which I don't agree with. You know, sometimes they use the word naturalism to imply that everything is natural, as it were, and then, but it ignores the things like social and cultural things which are not natural. You know, and the same with materialism. Very often, particularly religious scholars, you know, and postmodernism, whenever the word materialism is meant, they actually think of Descartes. You know, they think of Descartes, and it's mechanistic, you know, dualism, you know, the mechanistic, which is not. In fact, Descartes was a Catholic. He was a, you know, he was a spiritual thing. He just actually split the thing. Oh, he just think about Descartes. He appealed to religious people by emphasizing the spirit and mind and God, and he applied. He emphasized it with like Galileo, saying that everything else out the mind and God was a machine. You know. But materialism, for most materialism, they don't think in terms of mechanistic at all, you know. They have a much more organic kind of materialism, or if you get that word. I don't see there's any much, you know, there's some anthropologists call themselves cultural materialism, there's some anthropologists call themselves cultural ecologists, you know. To me, that means the same as a metaphysical, in terms of metaphysics, how people think of the world. Okay, I don't see much difference between naturalism and that. They're all to me similar. Where people differ between, say, Bookchin and Marx is how they see knowledge, and how they see ethics, and how they see politics. That's where people differ. But I mean, to me, Kropotkin and Marx politically are wide apart. But actually, they're both materialists. They're both materialists in that sense. If you get me. So I use the word myself. I use the word naturalism and materialism almost interchangeably. You know.
Yeah. Hi. Just briefly, for young and old, starting on Friday, the XR, the big one, is taking place all over London, and for people to get active and to get positive and to get linked up with other people who think the same way as you, because you're not alone. I mean, I remember going on some of the climate change demonstrations in London, and the thousands upon thousands of young people who were there was phenomenal. And the question is, how do we draw those young people together?
Yeah, seal that up.
That is the question. So if you're around in London for the next 4 days, from Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, go online, XR, the big one, and join a unit.
Thank you very much. Now, it does feel like we're coming to the end of this. So has anybody got any other quick, brief questions? Okay. Do you want to now? Thinking you guys are okay, but I'm going to ask you to kind of sum up, if that would be okay, Jeff. Because I think, you know, the Kurd thing is quite important in this, and if you could say a few words on that, that'd be excellent.
Well, I think that Abdullah Ocalan's impressive efforts to redefine self-determination from his lonely prison cell on Amrali Island is something that needs to be taken very seriously. I know there are limitations to Ocalan's thought. Among other things, people have brought up the anti-Semitism in his thought. And I think that's something that is linked to a certain kind of lingering essentialism in the way that he thinks about things. But it's a very important first start, going back 5,000 to 12,000 years. But I think historical materialism needs to incorporate more of Abdullah Ocalan's thought because it's proven itself to be so fertile in so many places in the world. In fact, and across the Horn of Africa, when I go to Nairobi and I see my friends in the ghettos of Nairobi, and I tell them about Ocalan being abducted in Nairobi, they are extremely enthusiastic about his ideas. And I think it could spread like wildfire throughout the Horn of Africa. And that would be a game changer, because right now in Rojava, the revolution is cornered, it's co-op, and there isn't much of a chance for the revolution to survive unless it spreads. But I think the conditions are right in the ghettos of Africa for some kind of synthesis between Ocalan's ideas and Rastafarianism in particular. So I think that's what I would say.
That sounds fascinating. Do you want to?
I want to build on what Jeff just said. This bookstore should have all the works of Ocalan.
We've got a good few of them.
Okay, all of them.
Yeah, we can definitely speak
because
up for that.
he is a seminal thinker, an extremely important thinker. I mean, 23 to 24 years in jail in this little island in the Sea of Bosphorus is a very heavy price to buy. I mean, you know, he's considered the Nelson Mandela of today. Except that he is also a theorist. Unlike Nelson Mandela, he has developed new vistas of understanding the past and the present, and that's significant. I consider him an extremely important thinker, and we should really commit ourselves to help free him as soon as possible, because without freeing him, there will be no possibility of settling the question of the Kurds in Turkey, or the constant Turkish military attacks on Rojava. So even though more than 900,000 people signed petitions to get him out of jail, out of that prison, it's still not working. The British government, all the crocodiles that sit in the House of Commons, and the other governments of the European Union. I mean, finally, the question was raised in the European Parliament. And by who? A Cypriot, a Cypriot politician. In any case, we have a lot of work to do to get him free, and to turn our serious attention to his writings, and to really think of building the kind of movement. And there's no way we can go into the subject matter of what that movement is all about, but it's very worthwhile studying and looking at it and seeing where we have to go tomorrow morning, starting at 7 o'clock.
Well, thank you very much. Now, just before we finish off, Atticus, you got any? Do you want to do some announcements about what you've got coming up? And you know, if you've got any, Sky, I'd be also grateful if you could give a plug for a few things.
Hi, my name is Atticus from Hackney Anarchists. This Sunday we're doing vaguely similar, although maybe more informal kind of thing. It's a book swap. The location is at a pub called the Royal Sovereign, which is a rather unfortunate name. But it'll be from 3 p.m. Onwards. There's also going to be another author there called, sorry, I seem to find myself with his name, Dan McQuillan, who's written a book, called Resisting AI, an Anti-Fascist Approach to Artificial Intelligence. So you can come along, bring a book, pick up some books, also our new zine. It will be good fun. So it'll be Sunday. Royal Sovereign is up in Hackney, in Stoke Newington, very near Upper Clapton Road. If you like, afterwards I can give you clearer directions. Or if you want to find out more about Hackney Anarchists or anything like that, you can follow us on social media. It's just the same name, Hackney Anarchists. Thanks.
I mean, I'm sure what you do is you stick an address or something else like that on your Twitter account so everybody knows it. But there's, okay, but the Royal Sovereign has got a bus station, a bus stop right beside it. You're not going to find a pub any easier to find than the Royal Sovereign. I was there a couple of weeks ago and I definitely recommend it. And I'm told they do very good pizzas as well, so there's that. There's also, on Monday 24th of April, East London remembers Rana Plaza, a memorial to mark the 10th anniversary of the Rana Plaza building collapse in Bangladesh. We've got leaflets of that in that corner there and over there as well, so please take some of that. Now, Sky, come on, you must have something happening. Sorry to embarrass you like this.
I'll try and limit myself to 3 things. So Thursday, the 27th of this month, there's a talk by Peter Gelderloos in Lark. So that's London Action Resource Centre in Whitechapel, and that's hosted by Earth First London. So I've got a couple of posters of that, you can look that up online. So a few of us as well, we're talking about starting a solidarity group in every London borough. So if you're interested in that, you can look up Tower Hamlets Solidarity or Haringey Solidarity Group and get involved. And also after a lot of struggle with asylum seekers in hotels and anti-raids, eviction resistances, and lots of other things, people under a more abolitionist umbrella are trying to, as well as West London Resistance Collective, now start East London Resistance Collective, and hopefully eventually North and South London Resistance Collective. So kind of building anarchism and abolitionism in the communities through those initiatives. And you can also look up Resist London on Twitter and London Solidarity on Instagram to connect to any of that.
Michael, it's wonderful getting all these announcements for these important meetings, and I hope as many people tonight go to these, but I'm going to add one more.
Go for it.
On the 25th of April, now, I don't want anybody to get a heart attack. There are pills at the counter. You could take one to prevent that from happening. But on the 25th of April at 6:30, Jeff, wonderful person here, and myself, we're going to be speaking about all of these ideas in the House of Commons. Would you believe? The House of Commons, I don't know why it's called Commons, but that's what it's called. The House of Commons at 6:30, and you're all welcome to come and to release termites, black termites. Where are they? Brian left in the corridors. Anyway, it's going to be a lot of fun. So you're all welcome to come. 6:30, the House of Commons, the 25th of April. There you go.
Right, so what I'll do is I'll put the address of Lark on the Autonomy Now Twitter thing so that everybody can find it. It's immediately behind East London Mosque, so you've got a couple of very good transport connections there as well. And Peter Gelderloos is a very interesting thinker, so I think people get it. Nick, go on. Oh yeah, yeah. One other thing is, I'd be very grateful if anybody who's not in the Autonomy Now email list, Nick, just about the counter there, please put your name down there because it's going to be in the regular thing. So we need to make sure that you know what's happening, before it happens and all the rest of it. And once again, I have to thank Tony Zubrov for making this happen. I have to thank Dimitri and Black Rose Books, Brian and Jeff, and thank you everybody else for coming here, and I hope to see you again. But come to Royal Sovereign on Sunday. It's a lovely venue as well, so I highly recommend it. All the best and thanks again. £17, but I'll give it a discount for it. Get you down sorted down at front.
I'll get them signed as well.
And don't forget to get your books signed!